Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph. We will be learning today Mitzvah Hashem Daf Tzadik Tes Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchos Krias, and today we pick up on the top of Tzadik Tes Amud Beis with a new Siman Samach Vav. Be'ezeh Makam Yachal Lahafsik. At which places in Birchas Krias and in Krias Yachal Lahafsik are you allowed to be mafsik when there's a need to be mafsik? Ube'ezeh makom lo yafsik, and in which places are you not allowed to be mafsik in Birchas Krias in Krias ubay yud seifim, and here we have 10 seifim. Says the Mechaber Sif Aleph, Bein haprokim, which I will translate as between the chapters, and of course we're going to identify those places as we go along. Bein haprokim, between the chapters of both Birchas Krias and Krias, shoyel bishloim adam nichbad, you are allowed to greet somebody who you have an obligation to be mechabed, to give honor to. Now, I use the words you're allowed to greet them, literally the words shoyel bishloim, you're allowed to ask after their well-being. You're allowed to say, oh, how are you? But it means a greeting. So Bein HaProkim, says the Mechaber, Bein HaProkim, the areas in Birchas Krias and Krias that we refer to as between the chapters. So that would be, for example, between Yotzer HaMa'oros and Avarabba. So you've completed the first bracha of Krias, you have not yet begun the second bracha of Krias. That is an example of Bein HaProkim, between the chapters. Between Haboicher B'Amo Yisrael Ba'ahava and Shema Yisrael. So you completed the second bracha of Krias, you have not yet begun Krias. That's also called Bein HaProkim. Now, it's kedai to remind the Olam at this point. Some of you might wonder, well, wait a second, how could you possibly make a hefsik between Haboicher B'Amo Yisrael Ba'ahava and Shema Yisrael? Isn't that making a hefsik between Birchas Krias and Krias? You're never allowed to make a hefsik between a bracha on a mitzvah and the mitzvah. But let's remember that Birchas Krias, we've spoken out several times already, Birchas Krias is not a Birchas HaMitzvahs, right? The brachas of Krias, it's not Asher Kedishanu B'Mitzvahs of Tzivanu Likra Krias. It's not a Birchas HaMitzvahs. The brachas of Krias, we already had explained to us already a couple of times, they're tefillos that Chazal were misakin should be recited around Krias. Because whenever we come to tefillah, we want to come to tefillah mitoch divrei Torah. So the Krias is the divrei Torah that accompanies the tefillos of Birchas Krias. So again, between the end of Avarabba and the beginning of Shema Yisrael is again Bein HaProkim. Between the end of the first parsha of Krias, Uvish Arecha and Vahaya Im Shemaya, that's again Bein HaProkim. So the Mechaber says over here, at these places that we refer to as Bein HaProkim, you're technically allowed to be mafsik, to go and greet an Adam Nichbad, somebody that you have to be mechabed, and we'll have to define what that means. Umeshiv Shalom L'chal Adam. But if somebody comes and greets you, you're allowed to respond to the greeting to anybody. L'chal Adam. You're Bein HaProkim, so of course it's more chamor to be the one who's going ahead and initiating the greeting. So therefore the Mechaber says to initiate a greeting, you're only allowed to initiate a greeting to an Adam Nichbad. Somebody that you have to be mechabed, you're allowed to initiate and go greet that person. But to react to somebody else's greeting you, that's more kal, because you didn't initiate it. You're responding to somebody, and you don't want to insult him. So the Mechaber says, Meishiv Shalom L'chal Adam. You're allowed to respond to the greeting of any person. And again, this is Bein HaProkim, between the chapters. Continues the Mechaber, Uve Emtza, but in middle of a chapter. So you're in middle of the first bracha of Birchas Krias. You're up to Tisparech Lanetzach, Tzereinu Malkeinu V'Gayaleinu B'rei Kedoshim. So you're be'emtza prokim. You're in middle of a parak. You're in middle of the ahavta. So you're in the midst of the first parsha of Krias. Be'emtza, in the middle of a parak, shoyel b'shloim mishehu yarei mimenu. then you're allowed to initiate a greeting to somebody that you have a chiyuv of yireh. Well, who's a person that you have a chiyuv of yireh? It doesn't mean somebody you're afraid of. The big machlokes rishonim, what it means, mishu yarei mimenu. Rashi learns it's somebody that you're afraid of. Somebody who you're afraid might harm you. Other rishonim argue and say no. The Mechaber is following those rishonim. The Mechaber says, what does it mean, mishu yarei mimenu? Somebody who you have a chiyuv to have yireh for. Meaning like awe. Who is that? Kigain aviv, for instance, your father. Kabedis avicha ve'esimecha. We have a chiyuv of yira as part of kabedis avicha ve'esimecha. Oy rabbi or a Rebbe Muvik, somebody who you learned Rav Chachmasai from him, you have a chiyuv of yira. Oy mishu gadol mimenu bechachma, or somebody who is greater than you in Torah chachma. And again, the Mishnah Berurah will speak about that. The chol shekain, certainly, melech, a king, a anos, or a powerful person who could harm you. So this is be'emtza prakim. You could initiate a greeting to somebody who you have an obligation of yira, or somebody who you have to be afraid of. Umeshiv shalom la'adam nichbad. And you could respond to an adam nichbad. There's somebody who you have a chiv to be mechabed, you could respond to his greeting. But this is not like bein haprakim. You can't respond to just anybody's greeting, because you're be'emtza prakim. That's more chomer than bein haprakim. So bein haprakim, you could respond to anybody. Be'emtza prakim, you can only respond to somebody that you have a chiv to be mechabed. Bein haprakim, you could initiate a greeting to somebody who you have a chiv to be mechabed. Be'emtza prakim, you can only initiate a greeting to somebody who you have a chiyuv of yireh. Continues the Mechaber, and he says, when we say that you could be mafsik, bein haprakim, to initiate a greeting to somebody you have yireh for, and to respond to an adam, somebody who's mechubah, somebody you have to be mechabed, says the Mechaber, va'afilu be'emtza hapasuk. In those cases, you could even be mafsik in the middle of a pasuk. Chutz mi pasuk Shema Yisrael u'Baruch Shem Kvod Malchusei La'Lavod, with the exception of the first pasuk of Krias Shema, Shema Yisrael Shem Elokeinu Shem Echad, and the verse of Baruch Shem Kvod Malchusei La'Lavod, Shelo Yafsik Behem Klal. Over there you cannot be mafsik at all, because that's the Iker Kabbalas Oil Malchus Shemayim, and when we are being Mekabel Ol Malchus Shemayim, we're not mafsik for anyone. So you can't be mafsik in middle of Shema Yisrael, you can't be mafsik in middle of Baruch Shem, nor could you be mafsik between Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem. So from Shema to Va'ed, no hafsakas. Im loy mipnei mi sheyarei Shema yargenu. Unless your choshish dagam might kill you, then it's pekuach nefesh. Pekuach nefesh, of course, you could be mafsik. Okay, so that's today's Shulchan Aruch. That's one long sif. Now let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is cut in aleph. Bein haprakim. So the opening halacha of the Mechaber was that bein haprakim, you could initiate a greeting to an adam nichbad. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you have to understand what that means, that you could initiate a greeting. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Davka b'shepagu zeh memela. The idea that you could initiate a greeting is that you happen to bump into each other. You happen to chance upon each other. So let's say you're in the Beis HaKnesses, you're in shul, and you're sitting in your makom kavua, and this person that you have a chiyuv to be mechabed, he walks right up to you, or he's walking right by your seat. So you didn't go after him. He was paigeya in you. He just came up to you. So now, this is somebody you have a chiyuv to be mechabed, you're allowed to get up and go ahead and initiate a greeting. Oh, shalom aleichem, how are you? But, says the Chavetz Chaim, aval, b'mashkim lepischai, but to go to his door and knock on his door, now that sounds like an odd case, right? You're in the middle of Birchas Krias Shema, you're in the middle of Krias Shema, talking about going to somebody's door, but here's a simpler case. Or let's say you're sitting in the Beis HaKnesses, you're sitting in your makom kavua, while you say Krias Shema, you look across the room and you see somebody who you have a chiyuv to be mechabed. So for you to get up out of your chair, to get up out of your makom kavua, and go walk across the Beis HaKnesses to go initiate a greeting, that the Chavetz Chaim says you cannot do. So, aval b'mashkim lepischa yoylelech bebeis hakneses mimakam kavua loy lemakam chaver litein loy shalom va'afilu la'aviv rabbi. Even if this was your father or your rebbe, so you live in a different town than your father. You're sitting in shul, you're davening shachris, you just finished ahavta, you're about to start v'hayom shamaya, so you're bein haprakim. You look up and you see your father. Your father is definitely somebody you have a chiyuv to be mechabed. You're not allowed to get up and walk across shul and say, "Oh, Daddy, how are you?" No, you can't do that. If your father walks up to your seat, so now you could get up and you could be shoyel b'shloima. You don't have to wait for him to say hello. You could say hello to him and ask him, "How are you?" Now, everything that I'm saying over here, hold this in your thought, because Allah lamaisa, we're going to say a little bit different. But so far, Shitas HaMechaber, this is what the Mechaber is saying. According to the Mishnah Berurah here, in Ois Katan Aleph, your father walks in, he walks up to your seat, you could say, "Hello, how are you?" But to get up and walk across the shul and initiate a greeting to him, that you're not allowed to do, even though it's ben haprakim, and even though you have a chiyuv of kibud. Va'afilu kaidem shehiskel bar sha'amar, kevet shu kaidem atfila. Chavetz Chaim reminds us. He says, forget Krias Shema. Forget Krias Shema. You came into daven, you put on your tefillin, and you're holding, if you daven Ashkenaz, you're holding my mizmor shir, so you're before Baruch Shamar. If you daven Nusach Sfarad, you're holding the middle of Hoidu, so you didn't say Baruch Shamar yet. There's no shaila of hafsaka. These are places of davening that you're allowed to be mafsik. Says the Mishnah Berurah, you still wouldn't be allowed to go be shayel b'shloimai. Why? Because we have a Gemara in Birchas. The Gemara in Birchas says, you're not allowed to go greet another human being before davening. Why not? Because you're not mechabed a bas of adam with a greeting before you're mechabed the Borei Olam with davening. So there's always an iser to be shayel b'shloim chaveroi before you go ahead and you daven. But that's when you're, in the lashon of the Gemara, that's also lahashkim lepesach haveroi. You're not allowed to go knock on your friend's door. So you're walking on the way to shul to the 7:30 minyan, and you know that you have a chaver who davens v'sikin every day. So you know he's up, and you haven't seen him in a long time. And you're walking by his house on the way to shul. You want to go knock on the door and say hello, how are you? You're not allowed to do that. You didn't daven yet. You're not mechaber a person before you mechaber Borei Olam. Can't do that. The Mishnah Berurah is equating to that. If you come into shul and you didn't yet daven Shemona Esrei, so it's kaidam hatfila, and you see somebody across the shul that you haven't seen in a while, you're not allowed to go leave your makom kavua and go over to him and say hello, because that's the equivalent of mashkim lepesach haveroi. You're getting up to go after him. That you're not allowed to do. So what are we talking about over here in the Mechaber? Where you're pageya by memela. You're sitting in your seat in the Beis HaKnesses. This person comes right up to your seat. So then, if you have a chiyuv of kibud, you're allowed to go and be shoyel b'shloimei. And the Mishnah Berurah brings this down in the brackets here for the Pri Begadim b'simid peites ayin shavach and buchach l'viatam ha'amar b'gemar yudal and aleph. The bamecha shavtoi lozeh. That's the lashon of the Gemara in Birchas and yudal and aleph. Bamecha shavtoi lozeh. You're being machshiv this basar adam. You're being machshiv this human being to go greet him before you greet the Borei Olam with tefillah. You're not allowed to do that. Ayin Sham b'Pirush Rashi v'Ayin Kedushin Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis Shelo Yeh Kvoidai Chamer Mikvoid Shamayim. A similar Gemara in Kedushin that you don't make the covet of a bas of adam greater than the Kvoid Shamayim. Ois Katan Beis. So the Mechaber said, Bein Aprakim, you could be shoyel b'shalom of an adam nichbad. First, Mishnah Berurah says you should know that when we talk about being shoyel b'shalom, afilu b'lashon laz. This means even in English. Doesn't have to be shalom aleichem in lashon hakodesh. It could be even how are you in English, which reminds me, go back up to the top of the Mishnah Berurah here on Tzadik Tesam and Beis. The Chavetz Chaim started with a line and a half over here that I neglected to read. Kol ma she'asar ledaber. He just gives you a rule. Whenever we say that you're not allowed to speak, that you're not allowed to be mafsik, you should know afilu b'lashon hakodesh asar ledaber. There's no, some people think that, lashon hakodesh I can speak. You're not allowed to speak lashon hakodesh either. Va'afilu teva achas asar. You're not even allowed to say one word. I remember as a child, I chanced upon these kulas. I remember some old timers who thought that there was such a kula, where they would be holding and davening in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra, and they know that you're not allowed to be mafsik in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra, so they would speak in broken Hebrew. That somehow they thought that there is no isser of being mafsik in Lashon HaKodesh. Says the Chavetz Chaim, there certainly is. Okay, now let's go back to Ois Cotton Beis. So that was the first thing that the Mishnah Berurah said here. Afilu b'lashon laz. When you're allowed to be mafsik, it could even be in English. Now says the Chavetz Chaim, and he brings this down from the Magen Avram, V'davka b'panim chadashos shoyel umeshiv. This halacha, that shitas hamachaber, that you could go ahead and you could initiate a greeting bein aprakim to somebody that you have a chiyuv to be mechabed. This that you could be meshiv l'chol adam. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is only by panim chadashos. Now I believe, we use in our lexicon, the words panim chadashos usually come up only in one place, and that is when we're making sheva brachas for somebody. We know that to make sheva brachas, we need a panim chadashos. We need somebody by the sheva brachas who wasn't at the chasana, who wasn't at a previous sheva brachas. Why? Because a new person brings a hisafa of simcha. It brings new simcha to the table. If we have new simcha, we can make brachas. If the simcha is the same old, it's the same people night after night, so then there isn't a hisafa of simcha. Why are we making new brachas? So that's where we're familiar with the term of panim chadashos. But panim chadashos in context over here, I believe what the Magen Avraham is saying is, it has to be somebody you haven't seen. And we're not talking about your chaver that you daven together with at the Vesikin Minyan every morning. That's not what we're talking about. Such a person, if you don't say hello to him this morning, if you don't say, how are you this morning, he's not going to be beroiges. The guy who's going to be beroiges is, you haven't seen me in 6 months. You haven't seen me in a year. You don't say hello to me? So that's the guy who's going to be beroiges. And that's why you have a heter to go initiate a greeting to him if it's bein aprakim, and to respond to him even if it's not bein aprakim. But like this, somebody who you see every day, there's no heter. So says the Chavetz Chaim, v'dafka b'panim chadashos shoyel umeshiv, she'em loy either yashiv or yishal yavay lidei sinna. Then he's going to be broiges at you that you can't do. Now comes a very important piece of Mishnah Berurah here. U'b'sefer HaChinuch gam kein kosaf. In the Sefer HaChinuch, the Baal HaChinuch writes, Demi shaloi ra'inu sheyakbid al chaveroi klal. If you're dealing with a person who you know is not going to be makbid, you're not talking about a shver baldover. You're talking about a guy that you know, he's an easygoing fellow. He's not the type who's going to get all broiges because you didn't give him a greeting or because you didn't respond to him. So the Sefer HaChinuch says, Mi shaloi ra'inu sheyakbid al chaveroi klal. Such a person, lo yafsik afilu ben aprakim. So for such a person, you shouldn't be mafsik in Birchas Krias or in Krias, even if it is bein aprakim. What are you being mafsik for? This is not the type of fellow that you have to be mafsik for. Al kain, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, lefi min hagenu, according to our customs, she'einanu noihagid lishol b'shalom b'beis hakneses beis hatfilah. When's the last time you saw somebody in the middle of Birchas Krias or in the middle of Krias get up and give a guy a greeting? It's just not done. We don't do it. So chalila lishoil hashiv afilu divrei Torah. Then chalila, says the chinuch, chalila, to go greet somebody or to respond to a greeting, or even divrei Torah. You see a guy learning the daf, you want to tell him a gishmak of art on the daf, or the guy comes and he asks you a question on the daf. You don't respond. Loy bein aprakim v'loy b'pesukei de Zimra. Not bein aprakim b'Birchas Krias, not in the middle of Pesukei de Zimra. So again, this is why I told you, halacha lemaisa, how are we noyig? we're not noyig like the Mechaber. We're noyig that middle of Krias Shema, we're not mafsik, not for anyone, not ben aprokim, not be'emtza aprokim. Now, when I say not for anyone, if it's talking somebody that you're afraid of, somebody who could harm you, that's a different story. Baruch Hashem, I don't think we deal with that too often. It should stay that way. Says the Chavetz Chaim weiter, Im avar v'hifsik b'Kriyas Shema. If you transgressed these halachas, and you were mafsik in Kriyas Shema, afilu b'makom she'ein rashay lahafsik, even in a place where you're not allowed to be mafsik. So you were mafsik be'emtza prokim. You were mafsik in the middle of a hayom shamaya for something that you weren't allowed to be mafsik. Some character walked in, you went up to him, you said Shalom Aleichem. Not somebody that you were allowed to. V'loi shaha k'dei ligmar kula, but you just said Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom. So its zichur wasn't the length of time that you could say the entire Kriyas Shema in. So then kulei alma in a chayzer rak lo yisei pasuk. So you only pick up again if you are mafsik right before the pasuk of Hishamru lachem pen yiftal avavachem. So you just pick up from there and you continue. The yesharim lo yisei ateva shapasuk b'menim hu b'malkaim desalik inyana. There are some that say that even if you are mafsik in the middle of a pasuk, you don't have to go back to the beginning of the pasuk. If it was in the middle of a pasuk, but kind of the phrase ended, like let's say you said Hishamru lachem pen yiftal avavachem v'sartem v'avadatem. So you interrupted Hishamru lachem. Watch out for yourselves. Pen yiftal avavachem, lest your heart be turned away. That's still in the middle of a pasuk, but the thought ended, the phrase ended. So then you could continue after your hafsaka. You could continue the pasuk. But if it's Hishamru doesn't mean anything on its own. Hishamru, beware. That's not enough. So if you were mafsik after the word Hishamru, you got to go back to the beginning of the pasuk. Ois cotton gimel in the Mishnah Berurah. So the Mechaber said you could initiate a greeting ben aprokim to an adam nichbad. What's an adam nichbad? Says the Chavetz Chaim, sheroi lahaktim lo shalom. A person who would be expected that you should initiate a greeting. And he gives examples. Kigoin, shehu zakein, an elderly person, oy tamid chacham, or a tamid chacham, v'cheinim hu ashir, or a wealthy individual, a well-to-do individual, but he doesn't stop after the word ashir. V'cheinim hu ashir, sheroi lechabed loy machmas ashroi, who's a roi that you should be mechabed him because of his ashirus. Not every gvir is roi lechabdoi mishum ashroi. You have some gvirim that the fact that they're gvir, the fact that they have ashirus, it does not make them worthy of kavod. It depends what they do with their ashirus. If they do something appropriate with their ashirus, if they use their ashirus, you have some tremendous philanthropists nowadays that do wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things with their material wealth. So such a person is an ashir that's a royal lechabdai misham ashrai. These are examples of an adam nichbad, somebody that you have an obligation to be mechabed. A zakin, a tamid chacham, an ashir sheroy lechabed le'machmas ashrai. So ben aprokim, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to initiate a greeting to such a person. He's cotton dalit. But ben aprokim, the Mechaber said, you could respond to the greeting of kol adam, anyone. Says the Mishnah Berurah, anyone shehiktim lo shalom, who initiated a greeting to you. And now it's very interesting. Umashba b'chedushe harashba, the Chavetz Chaim says that it's mashba in the words of the Rashba, the mutter lechatchila lishol b'shloim hakoyrei. Let's say you're not the one saying Kriyas Shema. You're the Adam Nichbad, or in this case, Chal Adam, the Mechaber says. Right? The Mechaber says that if somebody is Ben Aprakim, he's allowed to respond to the greeting of anyone. So let's say you walk into shul, and you see a friend of yours, and you notice that he's about to finish the first parsha of Kriyas Shema. Are you allowed to go over to him and say Shalom Aleichem? If you do, then according to the Mechaber, he's allowed to respond to you. But should you give him a greeting to make him respond? Says the Chavetz Chaim, it's mashma from the Rashba, but there's nothing wrong with that. Since he's allowed to respond, you're allowed to initiate the greeting. But again, this is not really negeya to us, because like the Mishnah Berurah said earlier, we don't do this. This is not the way we behave. We're not mafsik in Birchas Krias Shema, we're not mafsik in Krias Shema, we don't initiate greetings, we don't respond to greetings. And that's why the Mishnah Berurah says over here, V'ayin la'el b'sif cotton base. Ois cotton hay. Then the Mechaber spoke about be'emtza haprakim. And when it came to be'emtza haprakim, the Mechaber said, you're allowed to initiate a greeting of somebody that you have to have yireh for, and you could respond to somebody you have to have kavod for. And the Mechaber gave as an example of mishu yarei mimenu, somebody that you have to have yireh, the Mechaber gave an example, kigoin aviv oy rabbi. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cotton hay, Ritzayna loymar, Rabbi Muvuk. Rabbi doesn't mean your second grade Rebbe. Rabbi doesn't necessarily mean your ninth grade Rebbe. Rabbi means Rabbi Muvuk, she'ikr Torasai heimena. Your Rebbe, the one who you learnt your ikr Torah from. That's who we're calling Rabbi here. Afal pishu gadol b'Torah ata yosim Rabbi. And this is even true if du hast ibegishtig in the Rebbe. If you became bigger than the Rebbe, still, he's your Rebbe Muvuk, still you have a chiyuv of yireh. V'shayich b'hu moira, min diksiv ish imay vaviv tiroyu, u'tanan u'moira rabach k'moira shamayim. Ois katan vav, gadol mimenu. Another example the Mechaber gave was somebody who's gadol mimenu b'chachma. Says the Mishnah Berurah, the imam shavim. How about if your peers, you're equal in chachma? Have a bechlal b'tnei kavod, that falls under the category of b'tnei kavod. V'em ha'koirei gadol mimenu, if the one saying Krias Shema is bigger, enam mafsek klal. Afilu lo tamid chacham. Ois katan zayin b'chachma, he's bigger than a b'chachma. V'achrayim pasku da'afilu hu gadol mimenu. The achrayim, he says paskin, that even if this person is bigger than you b'chachma, it's still only rak b'tnei kavod. See, the Mechaber said that mishu hu gadol mimenu b'chachma falls under somebody that you have to have yireh for. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. The Achrayim conclude that somebody that's bigger than you in Chachmas HaTorah falls under the rubric of somebody that you're mechuyev to be mechabed, not yireh. Unless, says the Mishnah Berurah, im loishu tamid chacham muflig b'doirei, unless he's one of the exceptional Talmidei Chachamim of the doir, oz heavy b'chlal moira, then he falls under the rubric of yireh. Oz katan keches v'choshkin melech, certainly a real king. Afilu melech Yisrael have a bechlal b'tnei yireh. Even a Yiddish king, we should be zeicher to such a thing. B'meher Yameinu. But even a melech Yisrael, you have to have yireh for it. Diksiv saim tasim alecha melech. The pasuk says you should place upon yourself a melech shetehei a masai alav. You have to have ema. You have to have ema of a yireh from a melech. Ois kontes ay anos, somebody who's powerful who could harm you. Ay malshin, or a meiser. You have to be very careful around a meiser. Ois katan yud. The Mechaber said that even be'emtza ha'pasuk, in a place that you're allowed to be mafsik be'emtza ha'prakim, you're allowed to be mafsik even in the middle of a pasuk. Yesh oimrim de be'emtza ha'pasuk lo yafsik. The Mishnah Berurah brings down, and he brings this down from the Magen Avraham in the name of the Kesef Mishnah, that be'emtza ha'pasuk you shouldn't be mafsik im loy b'makim d'salak in yona, unless again it's like the end of a phrase. If you did interrupt the pasuk, you should go back to the beginning of the pasuk. When you're being mafsik in Krias Shema for Kaddish, Rabba, or Kaddish by Kedusha, or Bar Kvaid, if you can't hurry up and finish a phrase in a pasuk, you could break wherever you are, smack in the middle of a pasuk, smack in the middle of a phrase. The lismaicha bali svara rishayna shalom chilku bekach l'tzarich mitzvah rabba kizu v'lani samatzibur. V'achakach yachzol l'tchilas pasuk, and then go to the beginning of the pasuk. Ois katan yud aleph. The Mechaber said these halachas apply. Chutz mi pasuk Shema Yisrael or Baruch Shem K'vayim Malchusei Leil Avoyed. The Mechaber said Shelo Yafsik Behem Klal. By those verses, you're not mafsik at all. Says the Mishnah Berurah, She'ein Davar Gadol K'Kabbalas Al Malchus Shemayim, because nothing could be considered bigger than Kabbalas Al Malchus Shemayim. So there's nothing that we're going to be mafsik in the middle of Kabbalas Al Malchus Shemayim for. Umitam zel lo yafsik gam kein bein Shema Yisrael lebaruch Shem K'vay Malchusay Leilam V'ed. We're not mafsik between Echad and Baruch. Shegam hu meklal hayichud. Ois kon yud beis, you're not mafsik behem klal, mashma da afilu kaddish kedusha baruch hu lo yana. Says the mashmois is that even Amen Yehei Shmei Rabbah, even Baruch Hu, you don't, even Kadosh, you're not mafsik in the middle of Shema Yisrael and Baruch Shem. V'ayin b'bir halacha de efsher de im hakriya haya lakish al ishois. What if you're saying Kriya Shema, but you're saying Kriya Shema after Zman Kriya Shema? Now remember, if you say Kriya Shema after Zman Kriya Shema, then you're not being yoitza the mitzvah of Kriya Shema. You just get schar kikoyrei b'Torah. So says the Mishnah Berurah, then to hurak kikoyrei b'Torah tzarich lahafsik. Then it could be that you should be mafsik for Kaddish, for Kedusha, for Baruch Hu. As cut Yud Gimel, imlai, unless you're afraid that this person could actually physically harm you, then the halacha would be like we're going to see the halacha is by Shemon Esrei later on in Siman Kuf Daled. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The discussion of limud HaTorah should be made against Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua Sefuras Parnasset Shaduchim to all those in need, and we should be zeicher to see the Bias Gal Tzedek, the Meher of Yameinu. Amen. Be well.